Good morning. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to the professionals at the 19th Wildlife Damage Management Conference. My name is Terry Messmer. I'm with the Berryman Institute at Utah State University. I'm serving as the director, and in my most recent life, I'm also a COVID-19 survivor. And so as I go through this presentation, if it might seem a little jerky, or I might have to stop for a second and cough, that kind of explains it. I'm 60 days post-recovery, having spent about 3 weeks of that in ICU unit here in St. George, Utah, after I tested positive in January. And so what you see here in front of you is actually a photo of a blog I started to talk about that experience. And that does in some way relate to the presentation, and I'll get to that afterwards. The outline, what I'm going to try to cover, talks about the wildlife profession and about how wildlife damage management is really part of that. And actually, if you look historically, actually gave birth to the profession of wildlife management. And then I'm going to talk about some new challenges and opportunities. But along the way, also, I'll talk a little bit about some of the metrics that are used to define status or where you're at. The problem with using metrics is that if you don't have the metrics for 10, 20, 30 years ago, and you're trying to compare it to contemporary times, it's pretty difficult because you can't really measure your status if you don't know where you came from. But I'm going to try to get at that, so hopefully bear with me. When we think about the wildlife profession, typically folks think about the state wildlife management agencies and the associations. This is the word mark for the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which is basically a quasi organization that represents a lot of the state fish and wildlife agencies at the policy level. It helps to coordinate national policy, and it helps to represent the state interest in the national forum. Then at the same time, we've got the Wildlife Society, and the Wildlife Society came in the 1930s, and it basically was that arm of scientists providing science and education to support professional management of wildlife. And so when most people think about the profession of wildlife management, they go back to the 1930s with Elda Leopold and the publication of the first book on game management as arguably being the first start of that of the profession. When we look at wildlife management, wildlife damage management, we have a constituency. When we think about wildlife management and about our constituency, typically we think about the hunters and anglers of the country. And this slide shows some of the changes in those demographics. And so as our country ages, as the demographics change, so do the people that are participating in hunting, fishing, as well as representing our constituency. The other thing that's happening with our constituency is we're seeing major shifts from the standpoint of the racial backgrounds, racial demographics. The fastest growing demographics in the United States are Asian Pacific Islanders and Hispanic population. And so you see over time what's going to happen is we're going to see a major shift in that population. And with that shift come changes in values and attitudes. This is a slide that came from Mike Manfredo's recent work on American wildlife values. Mike spent 10 plus years looking at the longitudinal shifts in what people think about wildlife conservation, wildlife management. And what he's found over time is there have been major shifts from the utilitarian, where the idea of we're using wildlife for specific purposes, to the idea of mutualism, where wildlife has an existence value in its own right and should be viewed in some ways as being a higher plateau in terms of just use. And so if you look at the shading there, the mutualism is increased across the country. And there are some areas where there's still strong efforts in terms utilitarian. The other thing that's happened, and all of us are very keenly aware about that, is we've got a tremendous shift from rural to urban population. And this graph shows the projection worldwide by 2015 in terms of what percentage of the population will live in urban environments. And so that brings challenges not only to wildlife conservation, but challenges to wildlife damage management. The other thing that's happening, which I talked a little bit about earlier, was the idea of people are shifting. I'm a baby boomer. I was born in the 1950s and went through the 60s, but now what's happening is the baby boomers, those population are starting to, if you will, pass away, pass on, and they're being replaced by Generation X, Millennials, and Zs. And all of these particular groups see things differently than the baby boomers did. You know, when you look at the last election, it was really dominated by a lot of baby boomers getting out to vote, but also what we've seen is an increase in Generation X and the Millennials. And each of these generations view things differently, and they put more importance on issues of time as opposed to the baby boomer who would work 40, 50, 60 hours a week, whereas the Generation X millennials are more interested in having that time off and that opportunity to enjoy things that are important to them. Here's a graph. Here's a schematic that comes again out of Mike Manfredo's work on wildlife values, which summarizes the utilitarian and mutualism and how that shift is occurring. And one of the really big shifts is that, and that really happened as baby boomers started moving along. Baby boomers started seeing animals as in some ways as pets. And recent surveys by the Humane Society suggest that 87% of the public who have pets see those pets as family members. And so the major shift is the idea of looking at animals having specific rights similar to humans, and the idea of considering things that previously were considered normal in the care of animals and use of animals that are now considered inhumane. When we look at wildlife damage management itself as a profession, here's a pretty good article. You might want to go back. It was in Human Wildlife Conflicts in 2007, and it was authored by Jim Miller. Interesting to note that I talked previously about most academicians and scholars think that wildlife management actually began in the 30s with Alva Leopold, but in reality, wildlife management actually had its first origin in the 1980s, where we had the branch of economic ornithology that was developed in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, specifically to manage damage caused by birds. And so this chart shows the evolution from the 1980s or 1880s to 1896, and then on to recent times with the evolution of the animal damage program and more recently wildlife services program within the Department of Agriculture. What was interesting to note that the 1896 Division of Biological Survey, which actually was there specifically to look at the control of damage caused by birds and other animals, it was the forerunner for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Later on into the 1990s, we saw the evolution of an academic program at Utah State University with the Berryman Institute. The Berryman Institute, named after Jack Berryman, who was originally the head of the ecological services within the Fish and Wildlife Services, which housed animal damage control. Jack went on to have a career with the International Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency, and he has I guess would be considered for all practical purposes the father of wildlife damage management in this country. Well, in 1991, Wildlife Services entered into an agreement with Utah State University to develop an academic program at Utah State University. With that, they hired Michael Conover and they hired Robert Schmidt to develop that program. And so out of that program came several courses that allowed students at Utah State University to participate in the science of wildlife damage management. Over the next 20 years, about 200 students graduated under that program and are affectionately called Berryman students. The Berryman Institute also evolved Dr. Jessica Tagg's take on some administrative role with the Wild Pig Task Force. And so we've evolved into where we're doing more conferences. We recently did one on bird management. And in 2007, Michael Conover, then director of the Institute, chartered the publication Human and Wildlife Interactions. Originally, it was called Human and Wildlife Conflicts, but then again evolved over time. About the same time in early 2000, Utah State University partnered with Mississippi State to create a Berryman Institute East and West. And again, the focus at that time was to enhance the field of wildlife damage management through education, research, and outreach. At that time, the Berryman Institute at one time had 35 different research education projects at 25 different universities across the United States. At the same time, last year, Dr. Teague, the National Education Outreach Coordinator for the Berryman Institute, helped sponsor and put on a conference on outreach and education. We also have been working with AFWA to develop particular monographs. Here's a couple of them that we've got out recently. And the focus of these monographs are to take a lot of the science and management information that's been accumulated over time, create a document that's usable in a lot of different formats with a lot of different stakeholders, and at the same time becomes a repository for some of that information. Well, at the same time the Institute came along that line, we started doing some research to look at what do people think about wildlife damage management? What's their perspective? And so here's a paper that was published in the Wildlife Society Bulletin in 1999, which reports the results of a survey, an international or national survey that was done to look at what the public thinks about wildlife damage management. Now, what's novel about this is a mail survey, but what's really novel about it is the response rate. The idea that you get a 47% response rate nowadays is practically unheard of. With the number of different surveys and things that have been done, the public is getting survey weary. But one of the interesting things that came out of this, and I think a lot of this still holds true, is the fact that there's strong support for professional management. Some of these numbers might vary. One of the other things that might also change if we repeated this survey today is that number that grew up in rural areas. In the survey conducted, 80% of the population was urban, but about 60% of those urban population indicated that they came from rural backgrounds. And I would suspect that demographic has changed over time. And so if we repeated that, we would find a lot of people that really came from urban backgrounds. And so some of these perspectives might change. However, I still believe that the public has an interest in wildlife management, wildlife damage management, and they want to be involved in shaping the policy, but they're not so interested in doing the actual methodology. However, one of the things that probably will ring through, and again, this is based on Mike Manfredo's work, is that the idea of using non-lethal methods versus lethal methods when we look at addressing a situation involving wildlife damage management. Several years ago, we asked Bill Clay, former deputy administrator, to write an article in Human Wildlife Conflicts, which was a precursor to Human Wildlife Interactions about the changing face of wildlife damage management. Prior to Bill's retirement in 2018, we asked him to also go back and do a retrospective of that particular article. And basically what was interesting is the same hot buttons, the same 5 topics that were important in 2007, and actually in some of the work that Jim Miller did were also showed up in 2018. We've got suburban development. We've got certain wildlife populations that are increasing locally. We've got shifts in public attitudes regarding the welfare and use of animals. And then also, more importantly, and probably more concerning, is the focus of the media on wildlife issues. And most of that focus is on some of the more controversial things. For example, bird strikes. We had a recent bird strike in Salt Lake involving the basketball team, the Jazz, and that made national news. And so the idea there is that folks are concerned about these issues, but the media also is playing into that by emphasizing and highlighting maybe some of the more controversial things. The other thing of interest is the wildlife research and technology. You know, from 1990s when we first started to 2020, the changes in the technology from GPS satellite transmitters to all the things we do has created new opportunities for us to manage wildlife. But at the same time, we have to make sure that keeps up with the public's perception and understanding of what we do. Excuse me. One of the things that to do what I'm doing here in terms of looking at this infusion between wildlife management and wildlife damage management, and I think some of the other speakers have also done this, but we went back and we looked at the National Association of Fisheries and Wildlife Programs. There's actually a national association where those programs or those universities that have a fisheries and wildlife programs are a member. And so we went back and we looked at their websites and their curriculums to see exactly how many of them offered courses in wildlife damage management. Based on the 44 programs we looked at, we could find eight universities were offering programs. And again, there are some other speakers that have gone into greater depth about some of this, but this is a snapshot of those metrics about education. At the same time, we looked at these programs from the standpoint of human dimensions. You know, human dimensions as a discipline really evolved maybe in the last 15 to 20 years. But at the same time, when we look at these programs, there's quite a bit more of the programs that offer human dimension courses compared to those that do not. And so there seems to be some disparagement between wildlife damage management and human dimensions, but arguably human dimensions is a big part of wildlife management. Now, when we look at the policy end, this is a shot again of the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, which again is that organization that represents state and private wildlife management organizations at national and international levels. And so within that organization, there are some specific working groups, committees that are focusing on specific topics. All in all, the association has about 30 different committees and working groups that focus on various things. But as you can see here, there are some working groups that have evolved over time. Most of these working groups are fairly recent. You know, there's always been an interest in some of this, but the fact that they've got a working group and working groups now, you know, trying to better infuse some of this information into the policy, I think is a plus. I don't know, you know, 20 years ago exactly which of these groups exist, but I suspect if I went back and piqued the memory of some of the folks there, very few of these working groups, particularly the feral swine working group, that's relatively new. That didn't exist at that time. Okay, so now what I also did is I went back to the state wildlife agency websites, and I know some of your other speakers will talk about this in greater detail than I did, but basically it looked like from the standpoint of wildlife damage management information that about 2/3 of the state agencies had some type of information on wildlife damage management. Some of the programs were well advanced, programs called Living with Wildlife, where they provided more information, others providing a link to other sites. But I would bet if you went back 20 years from now or 20 years into the past and you tried to get the same information, these statistics would be different. So from the standpoint of that status within the agencies, I think there's been an elevation of importance. And again, some of that elevation is due to maybe the issues taking place in urban environments and also the effect of urbanization. Now, when we look at the Wildlife Society, I'm going to go into the research and the science end of some of these things. Here's kind of a chronologically of what's happened in the Wildlife Society regarding wildlife damage management. The first committee was formed in 1959, and then the Wildlife Damage Management Working Group, which is the oldest working group in the Wildlife Society, was formed in 1994. And so it's actually one of the largest working groups and actually probably one of the more visible in terms of sponsoring symposiums. And actually they are a sponsor of this particular conference. And so at the same time, when you look at the science end, the Wildlife Society produces or publishes scientific publications, the Wildlife Society Bulletin and the Journal of Wildlife Management. More recently, if you look at the Wildlife Society website, their standing position on wildlife damage management was just updated in March 2020. Now, regarding the science of wildlife damage management, here are the publications. And we know the Wildlife Professional, which came on a few years ago, has actually an article devoted every issue to wildlife damage management. And so that's a very positive. 10 years ago, this didn't exist. And again, the Wildlife Professional is designed to get at the manager. I don't know how many managers actually read the Journal of Wildlife Management or the Wildlife Society Bulletin, but one way to kind of get that information out and those case studies and case histories about active and applied management addressing wildlife damage management issues is through the Wildlife Professional. When I went back and looked at the Journal of Wildlife Management, I was curious to find out how many articles were actually published relative to wildlife damage management in the journal. And so either searching the title or keywords, these are the numbers. And so the highest year was 2009 and 2010. And actually why that's so high during that particular time is because that's at the same time when the Journal of Wildlife Management was merged with the Wildlife Society Bulletin. But you can see there in most years, there's a handful of papers that have been accepted and published in the Journal of Wildlife Management and none recently. And so what I have here is a graph showing the number of articles published totally in the Journal of Wildlife Management over time, and the number of those in the blue, which were wildlife damage management articles. And so you can see in terms of proportionately, there were very few articles in the journal that were devoted specifically to wildlife damage management relative to the total publication. And I went back and I looked at particularly the last 10 years, because I mentioned that earlier to that, what happened is the Wildlife Society Bulletin and the journal had combined, but then they were separated out again to become independent journals, with the bulletin focusing mainly on management aspects. And so we looked at the Wildlife Society Bulletin. And so here's a graph showing the total number of articles published. And we see the number of articles that are published specifically on wildlife damage management. One of the things when you look at these charts, there seems to be a gradual general decline, not only in the articles published on wildlife damage management, but the number of articles published, period, regarding wildlife management science. Enter the Journal of Human-Wildlife Interactions, Human-Wildlife Conflicts. As I mentioned, in 2007, Mike Conover started the journal. He called it Human-Wildlife Conflicts. A few years ago, that was changed into Human-Wildlife Interactions. And from a publication standpoint, that creates some problems regarding impact factors, because those folks that are looking at impact factors, they looked at continuity, and that continuity also reflects the title. And sometimes they don't make a differentiation between the titles, even though there's the same publication. And so this is a snapshot of the journal when it was first published in 2007, and in terms of the number of articles and the transition over time. And so gradually we've seen a steady increase in the number of articles published in Human-Wildlife Interactions, which again is the only peer-reviewed publication dedicated to the science of wildlife damage management. And so the other thing interesting that's happened over time is that we've seen an increase in the number of authors that were international authors. And so as you look at the graph, the blue represents the US authors, and the gold color represents the international authors. And so what we also did in 2017, we went from 2 issues to 3 issues. And then in 2019, what we've done is we've gone to an open access format. And here's what happened when we went to open access. One of the things that's happening is we are seeing the number of downloads that people are actually pulling off the web in terms of reading articles or opening it up and using it. And so we've got it set up where that you can actually access the journal via your smartphone, and you can actually read it on the smartphone. And so you can download it, you can peruse, you can read an article, you can search the journal for those articles. And so in 2020, we actually had 65,000 downloads. What's interesting, the articles that are downloaded most are those articles that refer to summaries of wildlife attacks or human illness relative to wildlife. For example, Mike Conover did a recent publication where he updated the status of wildlife diseases and human illness related to wildlife. That article alone has had 14,000 downloads. And those downloads come from international audiences also. So one of the other things and opportunities that we need to think about when we're talking about wildlife management is this urbanization thing. This is a study that was published by Mike Conover in the Wildlife Society Bulletin in 1997, and it reports of a survey of metropolitan areas in the United States. And one of the interesting to report here is that of those people he surveyed, over 60% of them reported they were experiencing wildlife damage management during the year where the survey was conducted. But at the same time, another 70% were saying we still act managedly for wildlife. And so what Dr. Conover did, he extrapolated those results to the largest 100 metropolitan areas in the United States and came up with some astounding figures of that folks are spending $3.8 billion in damages, to address damage caused by wildlife, but they're also at the same time spending an equal amount looking at management of wildlife. And so you've got this dichotomy going on where people like wildlife and they would like to encourage wildlife, but at the same time, they're experiencing damage because of some of the other things that are going on in that environment. Excuse me. And so when we look at issues of One Health, challenges and opportunities, we've got an urban population, we've got local abundant populations, we've got situations involving feral cats. We all have heard the science regarding the impact of feral cats on our native songbird population, but at the same time, we hear very little about toxoplasmosis and the possible link there. Toxoplasmosis is a protozoan that a lot of us have in our body. Estimates are 26 to 70% of the people have that actually inherent in their body. But annually, we get 800 to 1,000 people a year die from toxoplasmosis. And so more recently, coronavirus. Coronavirus is a zoonosis. And so when we talk about coronavirus, right now, this has got the public's attention that we're concerned about it. And so when we talk about the pathway of coronavirus or any zoonosis getting into human beings, we have this connection with wildlife population. The data suggests that there are 1,400 plus zoonotic diseases. And when we talk about a zoonotic disease, it's a disease that can jump from a wild animal to a human and ultimately cause significant problems, for example, like coronavirus, which I just showed some of the statistics. So the question becomes is, how do we combine these things? What's the role that wildlife damage management can have in this process? And this is a One Health diagram that came from Sweden, One Health program. But my argument here is that this One Health, the overarching One Health thing that to me ties everything together is wildlife damage management. The idea that dealing with those issues that the public are most concerned about relative to exposure and interaction with wildlife. And so given this post-COVID world, and given what we see about wildlife damage management, what can we do collectively as a profession to address this? Dan Decker in 2012, in an article in Human Wildlife Interactions, wrote about some of his concerns about zoonosis and wildlife-associated diseases. He said, basically, how will humans view wildlife if wildlife are continuing seen as reservoirs for diseases that are transmitted by humans? And so the bigger question he asked is, what can wildlife professionals do to better contribute to these conversations? And so here are some things that I think we can do. And so these are the what if and hows. What if we focus on communicating messages as wildlife professionals, whether it be wildlife damage management and wildlife professionals. And really what I'm putting those two into the same category. I think as a wildlife professional, it is in your best interest to focus on the spectrum of things dealing with wildlife management. And a big part of wildlife management in today's contemporary environment is the interactions that humans are having with wildlife in urban environments. And so the idea is that focusing on developing messages that talk about the role of human behavior. The wildlife damage management professional is unique in the fact that their focus is not necessarily, getting rid of the animal causing the problem, but it's talking about the situation that created that and the role of humans in that process. How about communicating messages to a wider audience, to a wider public? We communicate our science through the journals. We communicate it through fact sheets, things along that line. But what kind of effort are we really doing to go beyond that? And the last part about this is the idea that in terms of really getting this message out, there needs to be new education, outreach, and communication partnerships. And that has to involve universities. It has to involve federal, state, and private partners in putting together the education program that constitute the very root of the education to train wildlife professionals to deal with this situation. And I'm going to end up with one last thing. This is my blog. I contacted COVID in January, and for about 3 weeks, I didn't know if I was going to survive. And so I had to make some sense out of it. And so I didn't know how to do that. And so I got together with another professional, instructional technology professional, and he suggested the idea of creating a blog. And so I created this blog. And it's a new experience for me, as was COVID, trying to kind of share the story from a standpoint of how it might benefit others. And I realized in trying to attempt to do this blog that I need a lot more experience and training in how to communicate using social media. And so from the standpoint of wildlife management and wildlife damage management, not only sharing those messages, but looking at other opportunities where we can train and we can be better at looking at capturing the public's attention using other platforms. And from that standpoint, if you're interested in what happened to me, you can go to the blog. But at that point, I guess I'll conclude my presentation and subject to your questions.